Monday mornings in Judge Marla Devlin's courtroom were always the same. Misdemeanors, loitering, the tired shuffle of defendants through the machinery of justice. No surprises, no heroes. But on this particular Monday in Benton Hollow, Montana, everything stopped. The clerk called out the next case, voice flat with routine. Case 247B, defendant, Gideon Rourke. No reaction from the regulars. The bailiff, the court reporter, the exhausted public defender. Until the man stepped forward, layered in a tattered coat, worn boots tied with plastic strips, and eyes that didn't belong to anyone in this decade. Gideon Rourke walked with deliberate calm. Not slow from weakness, but from experience. From knowing that rushing never changed the outcome. He took his seat. No resistance, no words, just presence. Tom Elridge, the bailiff, hesitated, a man who had seen every kind of case. But something in Rourke's demeanor, the stillness, the precision, made even him pause. Judge Devlin glanced at the intake form. Only one page. No ID, no priors. Just a name written in perfect military block letters. She sighed. Another homeless man cited for unlawful camping, third warning this year. A minor charge barely worth the ink on the page. State your name for the record, she said without emotion. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the man looked up, and those startlingly blue eyes cut through the courtroom haze like a blade. And he said, Gideon Rourke. 2 words. That was all. But Judge Devlin's breath caught. Her pen stopped mid-stroke. Her pulse, usually calm even during sentencing, skipped like a needle on broken vinyl. Because she had seen that name before. 15 years ago, in a case she was never supposed to witness. In a secure facility behind 3 layers of clearance, testimony sealed forever. A folder marked, Camp Brigham. Do not duplicate. She whispered almost inaudibly. That can't be him. Tom Elridge leaned closer. Judge. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because sitting in front of her wasn't just a vagrant. It was a ghost. One the country had erased. One who'd been buried by a system too ashamed to remember the men it discarded after using them up. And now he was back, sitting in her courtroom, with nothing but a name and silence. Judge Marla Devlin reached for the intake file again, hands steady, but breath shallow. There it was, the signature at the bottom of the form. Gideon Rourke, block letters, clean lines, military precision. She had seen that handwriting before. 15 years ago, in a sealed courtroom, a classified military tribunal. A testimony that changed the trajectory of her life, even if no one else ever knew. She had been a junior clerk then, invisible, useful, sworn to silence. One affidavit had crossed her desk by accident. A name, a mission, a man. She had read it, memorized it, then watched it disappear into a shredder as if none of it had ever existed. But she never forgot, and now here he was, Gideon Rourke. Charged with nothing more than sleeping on a bench in a city that once owed him everything. Your Honor, the public defender, said a young woman barely out of law school, Harper Lennox, her voice uncertain. Do we proceed with arraignment? Judge Devlin didn't answer. Instead, she studied the man across from her. His beard was thick and gray, his hands rough with time, but the eyes, they were the same. Sharp, haunted, alive. Her mind flashed back to a classified briefing. A skiff room with no windows. A voice behind a screen describing extraction ops in zones that didn't officially exist. Camp Brigham, he had said. She remembered that phrase. The room fell silent when he said it. Even the air had seemed to pause. And now he sat before her, wearing second-hand clothes, but with the spine of a soldier. Mr. Rourke, she finally said, the courtroom falling into stillness. I'm dismissing this case. Gasps, murmurs, confusion rippled like a wave. The prosecutor leaned forward. Your Honor, with respect, this is the third citation this year. There are protocols. She raised a hand, sharp, steady. Do you know who this man is, counselor? The prosecutor blinked. A repeat violator. Wrong, she said, her voice cutting. This man is the reason 37 American diplomats are alive. He ran black flag operations behind enemy lines. Missions that don't exist on record but sit in the classified archives of this nation. The room went dead quiet. She pulled something from her bag. A file old, worn, and unmarked, except for a single code in red ink, BRGHM 42X. The symbol of a mission no one ever spoke of. I was there, she said softly. I transcribed his testimony under armed guard. I remember his voice. She looked up and met his eyes. I remember what it cost him. Gideon Rourke remained silent, but he didn't look surprised, only tired. She turned to the clerk. Expunge the case. Strike all associated charges immediately. Then she stood, not slowly, not tentatively, but with resolve. The kind that only came from bearing witness. And for the first time in her career, Judge Marla Devlin stepped down from the bench mid-session and walked straight toward the man she never thought she'd see again. Judge Marla Devlin didn't stop until she was standing directly beside Gideon Rourke. The courtroom held its breath. The public defender, Harper Lennox, stood frozen, unsure whether to sit, speak, or simply vanish. Even Cliff Banning, the city prosecutor, known for his bluntness, was speechless. His hands halfway to a legal pad he'd suddenly forgotten how to use. Gideon didn't move. He simply looked up at Marla, his expression unreadable beneath the beard and years of weather. What passed between them in that moment couldn't be captured in transcript. No words, just recognition. And something heavier, like unfinished duty, wrapped in the silence of those who've served and been forgotten. Come with me, Marla said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it filled the room. She didn't issue an order. She extended a choice. Gideon rose. No hesitation. The posture was unmistakable, not defiant, not defeated, trained. Even without a uniform, it was clear this man had once taken orders that no civilian could fathom. As they walked side by side down the center aisle, rows of pews on either side packed with lawyers, clerks, defendants, and staff, not one person stirred. Until the bailiff, a 20-year court veteran, stepped forward and stood at attention. Then without a word, the court reporters stood. One by one, the entire room rose. Not out of protocol, but out of something else. Something ancient. Respect. They didn't know what he had done. Only that it mattered. And that someone finally was standing for him. Outside, the winter morning was sharp and bright. The chill bit through Gideon's coat, but he didn't flinch. On the steps of the courthouse, Judge Devlin stopped. She turned to him. Her voice lowered. You saved lives, and then this country forgot your name. He looked at her for a long moment, then spoke for only the second time that day. I didn't do it for a thank you. I know, she said, and she believed him. They stood in silence a beat longer before Marla nodded once and turned back inside. Gideon Rourke stepped down the final steps into a world that had moved on. No cameras, no medals, just the wind. And a black car idling at the curb. Its door opened without a word. A man stepped out, clean-cut, no insignia, no smile. Mr. Rourke, sir, he said quietly. We've been looking for you. Gideon paused. The only thing that changed was his jaw clenched once. Then he climbed in. The door shut, and the car disappeared into the traffic like a ghost reclaimed by the silence. An hour later, Judge Marla Devlin returned to courtroom 3. The session had been reassigned. The room was empty now, silent, sunlit through the high windows, stripped of urgency. She carried her robe folded carefully over her arm. Every step echoed. She didn't sit, didn't unpack her notes. Instead, she walked to the clerk's desk and placed a sealed envelope on top. Her formal resignation, effective immediately. The clerk looked up startled. "Judge, may I ask why?" Marla managed a thin smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Because justice has more than one uniform." And then she turned and walked out, leaving behind the echo of footsteps and a legacy that no docket would ever record. That same afternoon, in a government facility known to no GPS or public map, Gideon Rourke sat across from a man with no nameplate, a gray suit, a blank folder, and a glass of water that hadn't been touched. The walls were beige, the silence clinical. The man, Commander Nash Holloway, leaned forward. "First, thank you for agreeing to come in. We didn't expect cooperation." Gideon didn't answer. He watched the man, waited for the reveal, the real reason they'd finally come knocking. "We never gave you the recognition you deserved," Holloway said, "the things you were ordered to do." Gideon cut him off, voice gravel dark. "I didn't come back for a medal." A pause. Then Holloway opened the folder. Inside photos. Not from 2004, from 3 months ago. A location tagged Camp Brigham Mountains. Dust. A perimeter broken, men in foreign uniforms. "We believe someone from the old teams." Flipped. Gideon's expression didn't change, but his hands slowly curled into fists. "Intel leaks, extraction protocols, sold, lives at risk," Holloway continued. "We need eyes out there. Someone who knows the terrain, the operation, the mindset." He slid the last photo across the table. A man's scar above the temple, dead stare. Gideon Rourke stared at it for a long time, then finally spoke. "That's not someone who flipped. That's someone who was never on our side to begin with." Holloway leaned back. "So you'll do it." Gideon stood slow and deliberate. "This time I write the rules." He didn't wait for permission. He turned, walked out, just like Judge Devlin had hours before. Because sometimes, the ones who disappear into the shadows are the only ones who know how to bring the truth into the light. An hour later, Judge Marla Devlin returned to courtroom 3. The session had been reassigned. The room was empty now. Silent sunlit through the high windows, stripped of urgency. She carried her robe folded carefully over her arm. Every step echoed. She didn't sit, didn't unpack her notes. Instead, she walked to the clerk's desk and placed a sealed envelope on top. Her formal resignation, effective immediately. The clerk looked up startled. "Judge, may I ask why?" Marla managed a thin smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Because justice has more than one uniform." And then she turned and walked out, leaving behind the echo of footsteps and a legacy that no docket would ever record. That same afternoon, in a government facility known to no GPS or public map, Gideon Rourke sat across from a man with no nameplate. A gray suit, a blank folder, and a glass of water that hadn't been touched. The walls were beige, the silence clinical. The man, Commander Nash Holloway, leaned forward. "First, thank you for agreeing to come in. We didn't expect cooperation." Gideon didn't answer. He watched the man, waited for the reveal, the real reason they'd finally come knocking. "We never gave you the recognition you deserved," Holloway said, "the things you were ordered to do." Gideon cut him off, voice gravel dark. "I didn't come back for a medal." A pause. Then Holloway opened the folder. Inside photos. Not from 2004, from 3 months ago. A location tagged Camp Brigham Mountains. Dust. A perimeter broken, men in foreign uniforms. "We believe someone from the old teams." Flipped. Gideon's expression didn't change, but his hands slowly curled into fists. "Intel leaks, extraction protocols sold, lives at risk." Holloway continued. "We need eyes out there. Someone who knows the terrain, the operation, the mindset." He slid the last photo across the table. A man's scar above the temple, dead stare. Gideon Rourke stared at it for a long time, then finally spoke. That's not someone who flipped. That's someone who was never on our side to begin with. Holloway leaned back. So you'll do it. Gideon stood slow and deliberate. This time I write the rules. He didn't wait for permission. He turned, walked out. Just like Judge Devlin had hours before. Because sometimes, the ones who disappear into the shadows are the only ones who know how to bring the truth into the light. The echo of the gunshot faded into the trees, but inside Camp Brigham the truth had just been unsealed. Gideon Rourke lowered his weapon slowly. Cliff Banning lay slumped across the desk, blood soaking into faded blueprints of the original compound. On the wall, a rusted metal locker, same one from 15 years ago. Unlabeled, still locked. Gideon crossed the room. No hesitation. A single key from his boot slid into place like it had been waiting. Click. The door creaked open. Inside, a flash drive, a sealed folder, a field journal, battered pages brittle with age. The cover read, Operation Iron Crest, classified level 9. He ran his fingers along the edges. The ink on the front page, his own handwriting. Back then they'd made him record everything. Every route, every kill, every life saved and lost. He tucked the journal into his coat along with the drive and folder. But as he turned to leave, a voice cut through the cold. Gideon. He spun, gun raised again. But it wasn't a threat. It was a silhouette in the doorway, hands visible, unarmed. Judge Marla Devlin, her face pale against the moonlight, but eyes steady. I knew you'd come back, she said quietly. He didn't lower the gun. Why are you here? I never stopped looking, she said. After that morning in court, I started digging your file sealed so deep it made me sick. Gideon's breath fogged in the air. You shouldn't have come alone. I didn't. From behind her, a second figure stepped forward. Harper Lennox, public defense attorney, the one who'd barely spoken in court. But now her face held no doubt, only purpose. We're not here to fix what they broke, she said. We're here to bring it into the light. Gideon stared at them, two women from different ends of the system, both risking everything. For him. For the truth. He handed Judge Devlin the drive. This will bury people. Let it, she said. He looked to Harper. Think your office can handle fallout like this? She gave a thin smile. We've already got a press briefing scheduled. And for the first time in years, Gideon felt something unexpected. Not hope, but momentum. They weren't just uncovering secrets. They were cracking the machine. And it was only just beginning. The press conference wasn't held in a federal building. It wasn't announced by email. No podium. No flags. Just a folding table in front of the Fairfax County Library. 3 mics taped together and a crowd that doubled every 5 minutes. At its center stood Harper Lennox, holding the flash drive like it was radioactive. Beside her, Judge Marla Devlin, her black robe replaced with a gray coat, hair pinned back expression, unreadable. And flanking them both like a shadow given purpose was Gideon Rourke. No badge, no uniform. But the way he stood, the way the veterans in the crowd straightened at the sight of him, said more than words ever could. Harper leaned into the mic. We have evidence, irrefutable evidence of a covert operation buried by our government nearly 2 decades ago. Murmurs. Cameras clicked. A reporter in a red scarf raised her voice. What kind of operation? Judge Devlin stepped forward. One that violated treaties. One that cost American lives. One that was never meant to come to light until today. She placed a copy of the Iron Crest folder on the table. Heavily redacted but real. Enough to make it onto every front page by sunrise. Then Harper spoke again, voice low, deliberate. And one man paid the price for all of it. Not in prison. Not in exile, but by being erased from every record that mattered. She turned. Mr. Rourke, if you're ready. The crowd shifted, phones raised. Gideon stepped up to the mics, and for the first time, he spoke freely. I never asked to be remembered. He said I never wanted medals or headlines. Just clarity. His voice was rough like gravel in wind. But when your country calls you a ghost, then uses your silence to stay clean, you have two choices. Fade away. Or fight back. The wind picked up flapping flags in the background, but no one moved. No one spoke. I buried my team in silence, watched names disappear, watched mothers get letters with no return address. He looked out at the crowd, young, old, black, white, every background, and I'm telling you now, those lives mattered. What we did matters. Harper placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. Devlin nodded once. Behind them, on a portable screen, the first declassified photo flickered to life. A team of 12 faces, obscured coordinates blurred. But Gideon stood in the center. Not broken, just unfinished. He stepped back as the crowd erupted gasps, murmurs, some with hands over their mouths. And somewhere in the middle, a teenager whispered, "That's him, the ghost they tried to bury." But Gideon Rourke was done hiding. The reckoning had just begun. 3 days later, the Senate Oversight Subcommittee held an emergency closed-door hearing. Behind sealed mahogany doors, the word Iron Crest was spoken aloud for the first time in 19 years. But Gideon Rourke wasn't in that room. He was walking beneath a pale dawn sky through a quiet cemetery just west of Benton Hollow. The ground was frozen, the air sharp, but he moved slowly. Like he'd walked this path in his dreams 1,000 times. He stopped at a row of simple stones, 12 of them, unmarked except for initials and dates. Each one a life lost, not in vain, but in silence. He crouched, took off his cap, and whispered their names. Not their code names, not their ranks, their real names, the ones no one else was allowed to say. When he stood, someone else was there. Harper Lennox, arms crossed against the cold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both knew what came next. "This won't bring them back," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "But it'll stop it from happening again." He nodded, and that was enough. That same morning, Judge Marla Devlin handed in a sealed motion to the U.S. District Court. Detached the sworn testimony of Gideon Rourke, official acknowledgement from the Pentagon, and 3 new signatures calling for legislation to protect whistleblowers from erased operations. One of the sponsors, Senator Tara Bloom, the youngest member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, once a junior law clerk who'd idolized Judge Devlin, now leading the fight Devlin could no longer wage from the bench. Within a month, a new bill had a name. The Carver Act, named not for a rank or title, but for a man whose silence once cost everything. The story spread across the country, not as a scandal, but as a reckoning. People talked in living rooms, coffee shops, halls of Congress, not just about what happened, but about the names that never got carved into memorials. The medals never handed out. The ghosts who walked among them every day. And through it all, Gideon Rourke stayed quiet, but not invisible. Sometimes he was spotted leaving community hearings. Sometimes helping homeless veterans into shelters they'd once avoided. Sometimes just sitting under a tree in Camp Brigham, the old base where it had all started, now being restored as a historical site. He never asked to be seen. But this time people saw him, because legends don't fade, not when truth is louder than silence, not when ghosts stop running, and start walking straight into the light. If this story moved you, if it made you pause even for a second to think about justice, sacrifice, and the power of one voice, then don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us for the next chapter, because here on KaYi, we tell the stories others are too afraid to touch. Real stories, hard truths, and the silent heroes who walk among us. We're just getting started.